Rachel stood in the middle of the glittering chaos, the air buzzing with clinking champagne glasses, bursts of laughter, and the rapid-fire clicks of camera shutters. Her family had outdone themselves. Strings of golden fairy lights draped across the backyard, a live band crooning romantic classics, and a tower of cupcakes so extravagant it seemed lifted from a bridal magazine. All eyes, however, were on the decorations. They were on her. She, the glowing bride-to-be, the woman everyone thought had finally found her happily ever after. Except she hadn't. Her smile, polished and practiced, was nothing but armor. Because the man standing beside her, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back, wasn't her fiancé. He wasn't even her boyfriend. Daniel Hayes, her best friend's older brother, the kind of man who turned heads without trying, was her co-conspirator in an elaborate lie. Their engagement wasn't born of love, but of survival, of desperation. The thought alone made Rachel's chest tighten. She had built her walls brick by brick after Evan's betrayal, but tonight she had let someone else stand inside those walls with her. And every flash of the camera, every cheer of congratulations from her oblivious relatives, only made the weight of the charade press down harder. She told herself this was necessary, that it was better than letting her ex see her broken. Still, the bitter taste of irony lingered. Her big engagement party was a performance, and she was its most reluctant star. The very reason for this reckless arrangement stood just a few steps away. Evan, tall, polished, smug in a way only a man who believed he'd won could be. He had once been her future, the man she trusted, the man she planned to build a life with, until she discovered he was already building one behind her back with her own cousin. Now, as though fate took some twisted pleasure in mocking her, he was here hand in hand with that same cousin, both of them wearing matching expressions of satisfaction. Rachel's pulse quickened when their eyes met. She could almost hear the whispered pity that hung unsaid in the air, the unspoken judgment that she was the one who'd been left behind, the one who wasn't enough. She'd sworn to herself she would never let them see her break, never let them win the game of appearances. That oath was what had led her into Daniel's arms, or rather, into the illusion of them. When she asked him for help, she hadn't expected him to say yes. Yet here he was, standing tall and unflinching, the perfect counterweight to Evan's smug presence. Daniel wasn't just playing along. He was embodying the role of the protective, attentive fiancé so convincingly that even Rachel almost believed it. Almost. But underneath her gratitude lay a knot of nerves, because she knew Evan well enough to sense he was watching, analyzing every flicker of her expression, waiting for cracks in her facade. The stakes were higher than ever, and the humiliation of failing was unbearable to imagine. Daniel leaned in closer, his voice a low whisper that only she could hear, his lips brushing the edge of her ear. "Smile, Rachel. They're watching." The command was gentle, but the effect was disarming. Heat pulled in her chest as his hand tightened slightly at her waist, grounding her, making the performance feel too real. She tilted her head toward him, flashing a radiant smile that drew approving murmurs from relatives nearby. To everyone else, they were the picture of bliss, the newly engaged couple glowing in the early stages of love. But Rachel felt the layers of the act fray the longer Daniel held her. When his fingers lingered over hers, steady and deliberate, she couldn't tell if it was part of the performance or something else entirely. The lines blurred, dangerously so, and her heart betrayed her with a sharp pang of longing she didn't want to acknowledge. She had promised herself this was just a show, a temporary shield against Evan and her cousin's cruelty. Yet Daniel's closeness awakened something she had buried, the possibility of wanting more, of being seen not as broken but as desired. The realization unsettled her. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. This wasn't supposed to hurt. But as Daniel laughed softly at something her aunt said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in an intimate, unconscious motion, Rachel realized the charade might cost her more than she anticipated. The betrayal she had endured had already carved scars deep into her, and she couldn't risk opening new wounds. Still, as Daniel glanced down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, Rachel wondered for the first time that night whether the lie they were living was about to spiral into a truth she wasn't ready to face. Rachel had grown up in a family that valued appearances above all else, where a polished smile mattered more than honesty, and where every choice was measured against the invisible weight of what will people say. As a girl, she quickly learned that reputation was a kind of currency in her household. Her mother believed daughters were meant to marry well, her father equated obedience with worth, and her extended family judged everything from career choices to the length of her skirts. For years, Rachel fought against that mold, masking her dissatisfaction with sharp wit and stubborn independence. Yet when Evan came along, she thought she had finally found someone who saw her for who she really was. He was charming, attentive, and in those early days, he made her feel special, like she wasn't just another piece in her family's endless puzzle of status. But his betrayal cut deeper than she could admit, not only because he chose her cousin, but because his choice confirmed her deepest fear that she wasn't enough. Walking away from him had been her bravest decision, yet it left her fractured. Since then, she built her defenses with sarcasm, barbed humor, and a cultivated image of strength. Outwardly, she could spar with anyone, deflecting questions and hiding behind a veneer of independence. Inwardly, she carried a quiet terror, the gnawing thought that love was something she would never truly have, that she was destined to remain alone or settle for the kind of half-life her family would approve of. It was this mixture of defiance and vulnerability that pushed her into the fake engagement, not just to save face, but to reclaim a sense of control she felt she had lost. Daniel Hayes had always been the one who left. To the outside world, it looked like adventure, the restless young man moving from city to city, chasing opportunities, dodging expectations. But the truth was less glamorous. He was running from the shadow of his father, whose bitter divorce from his mother had left the whole family fractured. Running from the small-town gossip that clung to him like smoke. Running from the weight of his own reputation as someone who couldn't stay still, couldn't commit, couldn't build something lasting. He had spent nearly a decade away, dipping in and out of jobs, relationships, and apartments that never felt like home. It was easier to leave than to risk watching something collapse, easier to be the one who walked away first than the one left behind. But when news of his mother's illness reached him, Daniel didn't hesitate. He came back, reluctantly at first, but duty pulled him into the orbit of the very town he swore he had outgrown. In returning, he also stepped back into the tangled dynamics of his family and community, the whispers about why he'd really come home, the probing questions about when he'd settle down. He hated the scrutiny, yet in a strange way, it felt inevitable, as though all his running had been leading him right back here. And when Rachel, fiery and unyielding, approached him with her outrageous idea, he recognized something in her. A mirror of his own bruised pride, his own need to put on a front for people who thrived on gossip. Saying yes to her plan wasn't about love, at least that's what he told himself. It was about solidarity, about giving both of them a shield to hide behind in a town that never stopped watching. The pact was simple enough in theory. 3 months. That was all they had to endure, long enough for the family gossip mill to churn itself into boredom and find another target. Rachel and Daniel set the terms with the kind of precision people use when walking into dangerous territory. No real intimacy, no blurring of lines, no falling in love. It sounded almost clinical, the way they laid out their boundaries, as though rules could shield them from emotions they didn't want to face. They rehearsed their story, crafted the little details, how he proposed, what their favorite restaurant was, the way they'd look at each other when nobody else was supposed to be watching. It was a performance, and at first, they both treated it like one. But the problem with rules, especially ones about the heart, is how easily they fray under pressure. The late night conversations meant to sink their stories stretched into something more personal. The rehearsed touches meant to convince their families lingered just a moment too long. The fake laughter they practiced blurred into genuine amusement when they forgot to guard themselves. Every line they had drawn began to smudge, until the very act of pretending felt like stepping onto a tightrope where one misstep could topple them both. Rachel told herself she wouldn't let Daniel in, not after what Evan had done. Daniel promised himself he wouldn't stay, not after a lifetime of running. But as they navigated dinners, family events, and stolen glances, both of them began to realize the truth neither of them wanted to admit. Some rules are meant to be broken. And once broken, the fallout would be far messier than the lie they thought they were. Controlling. The dining room buzzed with overlapping voices, forks clinking against china, and the low hum of a jazz record playing in the background. Rachel sat stiffly, her glass of wine untouched, as Evan leaned back in his chair across the table, arm draped possessively around her cousin. His smirk was a blade disguised as a smile, and when he finally spoke, his words cut straight through her armor. I can't say I'm surprised things didn't work out with Rachel, he said lightly, as though offering casual commentary. She's always been a little too cold to love. Laughter rippled weakly around the table, but Rachel's chest burned, her throat tightening with humiliation. The cruelty wasn't just in the words, it was in the ease with which he delivered them, in the knowing glance he cast at her family, as if to remind them all that he had chosen someone warmer, softer, more lovable. For a second, Rachel froze, every muscle locking as the shame of old wounds resurfaced. But before she could find her voice, Daniel moved. Calm, unhurried, yet decisive, he reached for her, tilting her chin toward him. And then, without hesitation, he kissed her. Not a quick brush of lips, not the kind of staged affection they had agreed to practice. This was different, steady, unapologetic, and so charged it silenced the room. Gasps echoed around the table. Rachel's mind spun, her pulse racing, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as though to anchor herself. The kiss wasn't supposed to feel like this, like a spark catching fire, like the lie they were living had suddenly become too real. When Daniel finally pulled back, his gaze locked on hers. The air between them thrummed with an electricity she couldn't explain, and the room around them seemed to vanish. If the dinner table had been stunned into silence, the world outside was far less restrained. By the next morning, the kiss had been immortalized across social media. Someone, Rachel's cousin most likely, had captured the moment on video, and it spread like wildfire. On Instagram, it was replayed in slow motion with captions like, "True love always wins," and "Move over Evan." Rachel's thriving. On Facebook, aunts, uncles, and coworkers flooded her inbox with congratulations, emojis, and overblown declarations of how romantic it all was. Even her boss had sent a text. "Didn't know you were engaged." "Congratulations, Rachel." She scrolled through the endless notifications with a sick feeling in her stomach, each new comment weaving the lie tighter around her. The kiss, once a spontaneous defense against Evan's cruelty, had now become a public declaration of their relationship. Every detail of their act was now under scrutiny, how they held hands, the way they looked at each other, whether their stories matched. The pressure was suffocating, and yet, underneath the dread, a dangerous truth pulsed. Part of her hadn't wanted to pull away from Daniel's kiss. Part of her had wanted to lean in, to lose herself in the moment. That, she told herself, was the most dangerous stake of all. because the world could believe whatever it wanted. But if she started believing it too, if her carefully constructed walls began to crack, then she wasn't just risking embarrassment. She was risking her heart. By evening, Rachel's patience had snapped. She stormed into Daniel's house, the glow of his living room lamp casting shadows across his sharp features. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both fury and something she refused to name. Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, calm as though her anger were expected. "It shut him up, didn't it?" he said evenly. "Or would you rather let them think you're still broken?" The words landed like a slap. She wanted to deny it, to claw back some ground, but the truth in his tone was undeniable. Evan's remark had gutted her, and Daniel's impulsive kiss had turned the narrative upside down. Her family now looked at her not with pity, but with admiration, as though she had won some invisible battle. Still, that didn't excuse what had happened. "We had rules," she shot back, voice cracking. "And you just shattered them." His gaze softened, if only slightly, as he stepped closer. "Yeah, maybe I did. But maybe some rules aren't worth keeping." The air thickened between them, every word, every breath charged with unspoken tension. Rachel's anger warred with the memory of his lips against hers, the way her body had betrayed her by responding. She hated him for being right, hated herself for wanting more. In that moment, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. The line they had drawn so carefully was already beginning to blur. And once crossed, there would be no pretending it hadn't happened. The evening had been carefully orchestrated, another Hayes family gathering filled with laughter, toasts, and the clink of glasses. Rachel had steeled herself for the usual questions about wedding dates and honeymoon plans, her smile practiced and polite. But then Evan rose, wineglass in hand, eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Funny, isn't it?" he drawled, his voice slicing through the chatter. How quickly Rachel managed to fall in love again. Almost too quickly. Probably because this whole engagement is nothing but a performance. A hush fell over the room, the laughter evaporating like mist. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Evan's smirk widened as he continued. "She's pathetic, really. Too fragile to stand on her own, so she staged a love story and dragged poor Daniel into it." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd, relatives exchanging glances, the weight of judgment hanging heavy. All eyes turned to Daniel, as though the fate of Rachel's dignity hinged entirely on his next words. Her chest tightened, terror clawing at her throat. If Daniel said nothing, if he admitted the truth, the humiliation would be unbearable. The fragile shield she had built to protect herself from Evans. Cruelty would collapse in front of everyone who had once pitied her. The silence stretched, suffocating, every second an eternity. Rachel's breath caught as she braced herself for impact, for the lie to unravel, for the inevitable shame to crush her completely. But Daniel didn't flinch. He stood slowly, calm and steady, his gaze fixed firmly on Evan. "You're wrong," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. He turned, sweeping his eyes across the stunned faces of family and friends before landing on Rachel. "This isn't fake. Not for me. I'm in love with her." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through the entire room. Gasps echoed, a cousin's fork clattered against a plate, and Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. For a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. His declaration was too raw, too steady to be staged, yet Rachel couldn't process it. Her mind screamed it was just another act, a desperate improvisation to protect their cover, to shield her from Evan's attack. But the way Daniel looked at her, unblinking, unwavering, almost vulnerable, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't prepared for. Around them, the silence grew heavy, charged with disbelief. Even Evan faltered, his smirk fading as he searched Daniel's face for a crack in the performance. But there was none. Daniel didn't falter, didn't look away. His words lingered in the air, searing Rachel more deeply than Evan's cruelty ever had. Because if it was true, if Daniel meant it, then she wasn't just pretending anymore. And if it wasn't true, if this was all part of the act, then he had just struck the cruelest blow of all. Rachel's breath came shallow, her vision blurring as heat surged up her throat. She couldn't stay, couldn't breathe beneath the weight of those words, not with everyone staring at her like she was the centerpiece of some twisted play. "Don't," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "Don't save me with lies, Daniel." She pushed back from the table, the scrape of her chair loud in the tense silence, and the room tilted as she stumbled toward the door. Behind her, she could feel Daniel's gaze, heavy and unrelenting, but she refused to turn back. Every step felt like tearing open an old wound, exposing raw nerves she had spent years trying to numb. Out in the night air, she finally gasped for breath, her chest heaving as tears blurred the edges of the world. The stars above blurred into nothing as she wrapped her arms tightly around herself. She couldn't risk believing him. Not after Evan, not after being told she was too cold, too unlovable, too broken. Daniel's kiss had already rattled her walls, and now his confession threatened to break them entirely. But if it wasn't real, if it was only another performance, then it would destroy her. She couldn't survive another betrayal, not from him. So she chose to run, to save herself the only way she knew how, by refusing to believe in a love that seemed too dangerous, too fragile, too impossible to trust. And in the echo of her retreat, the line between truth and performance shattered, leaving her heart more exposed than ever Dot in the weeks that followed the implosion of her fake engagement. Rachel made a choice she had never dared before. She stepped away from her family's suffocating expectations. No more bending to their gossip, no more performing for their approval. She found a small studio space downtown, not glamorous, not polished, but hers, and poured herself into building the business she had always dreamed of starting. For years, she had buried her ambition under the weight of what will people think. Now, for the first time, she didn't care. She painted the walls herself, stayed up late designing logos, learned the unglamorous details of permits and invoices. The independence was grueling, but it was also liberating. Each decision she made without consulting her family was a quiet rebellion, a declaration that she could stand on her own 2 feet. There were moments of doubt, nights when she stared at her reflection and wondered if Evan had been right all along, if she was too cold, too unlovable. But those thoughts no longer controlled her. Slowly, she discovered that self-worth wasn't built from applause or romance, but from the quiet satisfaction of choosing herself every single day. Rachel no longer lived for survival, for keeping her head just above water. She was beginning to live for herself, and in that shift, she found a kind of power she hadn't known she possessed. Meanwhile, Daniel's return home forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. For years, he told himself he was a runner, destined to leave before anything or anyone tied him down. But the truth was simpler and far heavier. He wasn't afraid of being trapped. He was afraid of losing. Watching his parents' marriage collapse had carved that fear into him, convincing him that love was temporary, fragile, doomed. But Rachel had shattered that narrative. Being with her, even pretending at first, had made him want to stay. Not because of obligation, not because of guilt, but because she made staying feel like strength rather than weakness. For the first time, he stopped running. He sat with his mother during her treatments, reconnected with old friends, faced the ache of roots he once thought were chains. And when he thought of Rachel, he realized he didn't want to save her with grand gestures or performances. He wanted to meet her with honesty, with the one thing he had always avoided, vulnerability. So he went to her, not with flowers or a speech rehearsed in front of a mirror, but with bare truth. "I didn't fall for you because of a deal," he told her quietly, the weight of his words steady. "I fell because you made me want to stay. And I've never wanted that before." Rachel listened, her heart pounding, her defenses tugging at her to retreat. Trusting again felt like standing barefoot on broken glass, every step dangerous, every movement painful. But Daniel's words were not polished like Evan's promises had been, not slick or sweet. They were raw, imperfect, and real. She studied him, waiting for a crack, for some sign that this too was performance. But all she saw was the same man who had kissed her to silence Evan's cruelty, who had stood tall against humiliation, who had stayed even when leaving would have been easier. Slowly, tentatively, she allowed herself to believe him. Healing didn't come in one sweeping moment. It arrived in fragments. In the way Daniel sat beside her during late nights at her studio, helping sort receipts even though he hated paperwork. In the way he didn't push her for trust but earned it with patience. In the way she, one day, caught herself laughing without bitterness, realizing she no longer thought of Evan at all. Rachel didn't give her heart back all at once. She let it unfold piece by fragile piece. And Daniel didn't claim it. He simply held space for it. In that quiet, deliberate process, Rachel finally understood that love wasn't about performance or validation. It was about choosing, again and again, to stay open despite the risk of hurt. And as she let Daniel's hand slip into hers, steady and certain, she realized she was no longer surviving. She was living. Months later, life had settled into something quieter, steadier, and undeniably real. The chaos of family gossip had faded into the background, like static from a radio left on too long. Rachel's apartment, once bare and uncertain, had become a reflection of her own growth. Shelves filled with books she actually wanted to read, plants thriving by the window, sketches of her business ideas pinned to the walls. On the balcony, the city stretched out beneath them, its hum softened by the early morning haze. Rachel sat curled in a chair, a mug of coffee warming her hands, while Daniel leaned against the railing, watching the sunrise paint the sky in strokes of orange and gold. There was no audience, no cameras, no expectations pressing in on them. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she was performing. She didn't have to smile to convince anyone of her worth. The man beside her wasn't holding her hand because the world was watching. He was here simply because he wanted to be. And in that quiet, Rachel felt a peace she had once thought impossible. Rachel set her coffee down and glanced at the small velvet box tucked away on the table, a relic of their charade. With a slow, deliberate motion, she lifted the fake engagement ring and placed it between them. The morning light caught the stone, making it gleam with the weight of everything it represented: lies, survival, fear. For a long moment, they both stared at it in silence. Then Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a ring that was nothing like the first. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, not designed to dazzle a crowd or impress a family. It was simple, a modest band with a single stone, unpolished, raw, and quietly beautiful. He set it down in place of the old one, his gaze steady on hers. No words, no speeches, just a quiet offering. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she looked at it, her chest tightening with an ache that was both terrifying and tender. This wasn't about performance or pretense. This was real. Daniel wasn't asking her to be anyone other than herself. He wasn't saving her from gossip or shielding her from pity. He was simply choosing her, in the quiet of a morning where no one else was watching. Rachel's fingers trembled as she brushed against the new ring, the cool metal grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't slip it onto her finger right away. Instead, she stared at it, the weight of the moment pressing gently but firmly on her heart. Her voice came softly, almost as though she were speaking only to herself, a fragile whisper carried on the morning breeze. This time, it's not pretend. The words hung in the air, simple but profound, carrying every scar, every fear, every piece of healing she had fought for. Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't counter with declarations or promises. Instead, he smiled, a quiet, steady smile that reached his eyes and took her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles in the simplest gesture of certainty. It was enough, more than enough, because this love wasn't born of spectacle or lies or desperate defenses against betrayal. It was born in the quiet, in the spaces where performance ended and truth remained. On that balcony with the world still waking below them, Rachel and Daniel sat side by side, not as actors in a story written by others, but as two people who had finally chosen love, fully, freely, on their own terms. No crowd, no stage. Just them, and for the first time, Rachel realized she didn't need anything more,